There we go, that started. Thank you all for being here. This is our fourth event for CASEP this fall, and we are looking forward to, I think, 2 more in the spring that we'll be scheduling. We're still working on the schedule. Spring is always a little bit of a tighter schedule, but we've had some great lectures so far, and we're going to end on a great lecture, I know. May Sim will be presenting to us on Aristotle and Mencius, Resources for Transgenerational Justice. May received her PhD from Vanderbilt University, and she wrote her dissertation, Aristotle's Understanding of Form and Universal, under the direction of Alistair McIntyre. She is a contributing editor to The Crossroads of Norm and Nature, Essays on Aristotle's Ethics and Metaphysics, and From Puzzles to Principles, Essays on Aristotle's Dialectic. Her book, Remastering Morals with Aristotle and Confucius, came out from Cambridge University Press in 2007, and is a comparison of the ethical life in Aristotle and Confucius. And she is currently working on a book-length account of human rights from the Confucian perspective, and a book on metaphysics and ethics. And the talk today, I believe, will be contributing to the book on human rights. So please welcome May Sim. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now share my screen. And can you see the screen? Now, I'm going to also rely on you to tell me if the screen is now. It's already giving me the message that the screen is behind the Zoom. Is it progressing? Do you see the next slide, questions about justice?
No, I just see the title slide.
Okay, so I'm going to try to reset that. It just happens. All right. So
I think this will be better, yes.
Is this moving?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so thanks a lot for this invitation, and I have benefited tremendously from the previous talks, and I hope to, have many questions from you after this talk. So when it comes to questions about justice, the concept of justice, here are some that are frequently asked. What is it? What sorts of actions are just? To whom is justice owed? And does justice require that people are in certain relationships? And finally, is there a metaphysical justification for justice? Now, just considering this concept of justice, it is challenging for people who occupy a shared space and time, people in the same generation. How about people who would never come into contact with each other? And these are the transgenerational communities, and they have no interaction with each other, either because some have died or have not yet been born. And they don't engage in actions that bear roles and relations to each other or form moral communities that entail justice, rights, and obligations. So the concept of justice that we are normally familiar with applies to contemporaneous generations, that is, people who have contact with those who are immediately preceding and succeeding their own communities. And the question is whether such a concept of justice is applicable to transgenerational communities, or do we need an alternative version or account of justice? Now, current debates about transgenerational justice involve some who support the existence of future generations, but not for offering them the same standards of living as the current generation. some consider conflicting interests of transgenerational communities and ask how such interests are justified. Current debates also include those who philosophize about a metaphysics of transgenerational actions that justify obligations toward future generations. So they say that the future is needed to complete whatever actions the present generation has begun. So for instance, a social action to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change must be continued by future generations to have the desired impact. And as a result of that, we owe these future generations certain duties. Now, one commentator who offers such a view is Tiziana Andina. Her article, Climate Issue, the Principle of Transgenerational Responsibility, is one that I will talk about briefly. And her view is that if the future generation is expected to fulfill the duties of completing actions that the present generation has started, then the future should be provided the rights that correspond to those duties. And those rights would include, for instance, the right of the future to exist and also to have the conditions of existence, such as the necessary economic and environmental conditions. Moreover, she proposes this view of principle of transgenerational responsibility, which maintains that the future has a right to exist because being is better than non-being. And the future has a right to exist too because it is required to complete our transgenerational social actions. Finally, she also maintains that such a responsibility toward the future would imply a political stance to the world's poorer nations, since they are the ones who would struggle the most with climate change. As she puts it, the biggest emitters are generally also the richest nations with the greatest historical responsibility for emissions. So it is reasonable to expect that those countries should assume greater responsibility for reducing emissions, end quote. She then recommends that the criterion of vulnerability not be limited to the current poor, but to include future generations who are most at risk of non-being. Now, my preliminary criticism of Andina's prioritizing being over non-being is that her view depends on two assumptions. The first is that population growth does not contribute to the increase in carbon emissions, and or second, the technological advances can compensate for increasing carbon footprint from continued population growth. However, looking at the Center for Biological Diversity, they, following Murtaugh and Schlax, maintain, quote, in discussions about climate change, we tend to focus on the carbon emissions of an individual over his or her lifetime. Those are important issues, and it is essential that they should be considered. But an added challenge facing us is continuing population growth and increasing global consumption of resources. Future growth amplifies the consequences of people's reproductive choices today, the same way that compound interest amplifies a bank balance, end quote. So as Murtaugh and Schlax's study has shown, it is highly unlikely that the continual promotion of existence over non-existence, which leads to increasing consumption and carbon emissions, will solve our climate change crisis, hence calling into question Undina's prioritization of being over non-being. Now, moving on to a second metaphysics of social actions, and I remind you, it is that social actions bind the current to the future generations through rights and duties, because the present generation needs the future to complete social actions it has started. Now, again, I think that this approach of hers is based on two assumptions. First, that future generations would choose to complete social actions that previous generations, including those of the past. And second, that future generations would also subscribe to the same reasoning about ensuring certain rights to their future generations in order to complete their social actions. And my questions for Undina's assumptions are as follows. First, would future generations be inclined to complete the social actions initiated by the present generation? And second, would they subscribe to the same reasoning about the future generations to come? Now, Undina herself acknowledges difficulties in implementing her account of transgenerational responsibility. As she puts it, quote, the general lack of public awareness of the obligation that every generation has towards the future, despite the fact that it is an obligation that we accept whenever we expect that future generations will assume the task of fulfilling what we want them to fulfill, end quote. Another difficulty is one about democracy. According to Undina, democracy depends on the citizens' equal participation and representation. Unfortunately, future generations don't yet exist for such representations. As a result, she maintains that changes must be made to democracy to enable future people to be represented, or their existence and future democracies will be at risk. Now, another proposal of moral responsibility is by Fei Teng, and hers is an account from a Confucian perspective. And her view is that Confucianism can provide the moral justifications for intergenerational responsibility. And you know, I actually agree in general with her approach, and she offers us a virtue-based approach. Unlike Undina's metaphysics of action, Teng justifies transgenerational responsibility with the virtue of Ren, or benevolence, or humaneness. And this account is different from Undina's because whereas Undina's account is self-serving in that you're only fulfilling duties to the future so that they could in turn continue the actions that you have begun, in Teng's account, it's not self-serving, but rather other regarding, in that you are relying on your virtue and just fulfilling obligations to the future for the sake of the future and for the sake of being benevolent or humane. But like Undina's metaphysics of being, Teng also offers an account of Sheng Sheng, which is the ceaseless life generation of all beings. And her basis for this claim is that everything originates from heaven. Now, just a qualification, the word for heaven, Tian, in Chinese doesn't have the same connotations as heaven in a Western account. It literally means the sky, and it has a more cosmic meaning. So first of all, to elaborate, her view of Sheng Sheng is that the virtue, it is the virtue of heaven and earth, in that heaven and earth originate and support the ceaseless life generation of all beings. Secondly, she maintains that sheng sheng is the purpose and virtue of all beings, saying the universe keeps producing and growing. It is the desire of all beings, and the universe endorses it. And finally, her claim is that the cultivation of dren, or benevolence or humaneness, is the particular way that human beings express the virtue of sheng sheng, and it allows humans to join heaven and earth to support the ceaseless life generation of all beings and the universe as a whole. Now, just as Undina's prioritizing being over non-being is open to Murtaugh and Schlax's criticism of continual population growth and consumption in dealing with climate change, Teng Sheng Sheng, as the ceaseless generation of all beings, faces the same problem. Now, but more specific to Teng's Confucian perspective is that the Confucian texts actually don't support her view of sheng sheng. To look at Mencius, for instance, dren or benevolence is actually not directed toward animals. In fact, Mencius thinks that animals are meant to be eaten. So if you want to be eating animals with a good conscience, stay out of the kitchen so that you won't be watching them being slaughtered. And moreover, Confucius and Mencius would agree that a choice of death is preferable over one's having to act unrighteously. So what I want to do here for the rest of my talk is to compare Aristotle and Mencius and to tease out some resources for dealing with the transgenerational responsibility and justice issues. And the reason why I'm comparing these two thinkers is that they share the common belief of a virtue-oriented ethics that includes justice, and that in turn is based on their metaphysics of human nature that is responsible for telling us how human beings ought to behave in order to flourish. And ultimately, in order to achieve human flourishing, they also agree that certain economic, social, and political and environmental goods, if they're alive today, are required. And what I'll show through a comparison of these two is that they'll offer different resources for transgenerational justice and resolve the challenges I've raised for Undina and Teng. So to begin, Aristotle's account of human nature is that it is neither good nor bad, but it can become good. And he offers us the human function argument that is perfected, that human beings are perfected by two types of wisdom, the practical and the theoretical. And these are traceable to his rational soul division into the deliberative and the speculative parts, respectively, and also sectioning of a non-rational desiring part that includes our emotions and bodily desires. So here's the soul division, and you see that there's a division between the rational and the non-rational part, and the rational part in turn is perfected by the intellectual virtues of Sophia, or wisdom, and Phronesis, or practical wisdom, and that's separate from the non-rational part, our desires that are perfected in the moral virtues of courage, generosity, justice, etc. Now, moving on to Mencius's human nature, he would want to say that human nature is already good or inclines us toward goodness. And he states, all humans have hearts that are not unfeeling toward others, end quote. And to prove that, he asks us to think about a child who is about to fall into a well. And Mencius's view is that regardless of the lack of relationship of anyone with the child or with the child's parents, or regardless of there not being anyone there whom one might wish to impress, one would have the feelings of alarm and compassion when faced with this incident. And he takes that to be evidence for the fact that all of us are good because we possess this compassion. Now, in addition to the feeling of compassion, there are three other feelings. So to begin, he says, if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not human. And here are three other feelings that also make us human for Mencius. So there's the feeling of shame or disdain. So you notice that we are capable of feeling ashamed when we do something that is bad, and disdainful toward others who are doing bad things. We have this feeling of deference toward our parents and elders, and also this feeling of approval of what is right and disapproval of what is wrong. So we all want to be right. So as he puts it, if you let people follow their feelings, which is their original nature, they will be able to do good. This is what is meant by saying that human nature is good. Now, more elaborately, for Mencius, the feeling, or what he calls a sprout of compassion, when developed and perfected, will become the virtue of benevolence or humaneness. And the feeling or the sprout of shame or disdain, when cultivated and perfected, will become the virtue of righteousness or E. And the feeling or the sprout of deference toward our elders, when developed, will give us the virtue of ritual propriety, in that we'll know how to relate in a harmonious and respectful way toward other human beings. And finally, the feeling of the approval of rightness and disapproval of wrongness, when developed, will result in the virtue of wisdom. So Aristotle would say that, in response to Mencius's emphasis on the feelings, he'll say that human beings are capable of feelings such as anger, fear, love, etc. But he would disagree with Mencius's view that our feelings are already the sprouts of virtue that can become full virtues. And the reasons are as follows, that he actually distinguishes our feelings from virtues, in that feelings such as capacities that we have, whereas virtues are cultivated states. And people are not praised nor blamed for having or being capable of having feelings, but they are praised for having virtues and blamed if they lacked the virtues. We just have the feelings that we have. We don't choose to have them, whereas the virtues are chosen. One chooses to be a courageous person, a generous person, and so forth. And when we have feelings, we're moved by something that is outside of us, whereas the virtues are internal states that we have cultivated, that dispositions or readiness to act in certain ways. So for Aristotle, rationality is essential. More specifically, it is the speculation and deliberation that make us human. And feelings then must be controlled by reason in order for us to perform the human function of acting with rationality and being good. So the differences between Aristotle and Mencius stem, I want to say, from the different views of human nature. Whereas for Aristotle, the feelings are relegated to the desiring non-rational part of the soul. For Mencius, the four sprouts of feelings are not separated into different parts of our human nature, or what he calls the heart mind. So the heart mind is both capable of feeling and understanding and reflecting on each of the feelings or incipient virtues. And so in general, Mencius's view does not separate feelings from the virtues. For both Aristotle and Mencius, the virtues are required to be cultivated or habituated. So neither believes that we can become virtuous by simply following a set of rules or laws, but laws have a special place in the habituation of virtues for Aristotle. As he puts it, the legislator makes laws that tell citizens what virtues to habituate. So for instance, quote, the law instructs us to do the actions of a brave person, not to leave the battle line, or to flee, or to throw away our weapons, of a temperate person, not to commit adultery or wanton aggression, of a mild person, not to strike or revile another, and actions in accord with the other virtues, and prohibits actions in accord with the vices. Now, Mencius, in contrast, maintains that the laws in themselves, even though they reflect the correct way or the Tao, they need concrete models in order to be effective. So for instance, he gives the following analogies. When it comes to the use of the pitch pipes, they must be used in conjunction with the model of the music master Kwang setting of the 5 notes. When it comes to the use of the compass, once again, it must be used in conjunction with the model of the artisan Gongshu's drawing of the perfect circle. So ultimately, when it comes to implementing the ways of Yao and Xun, they must be implemented in conjunction with the concrete model of benevolent government. As he puts it, suppose there are some who have benevolent hearts and benevolent reputations, but the people do not receive their kindness, and they cannot be a model for later generations. This is because they do not put into effect the way of the former kings. Mere goodness is insufficient to govern. Mere laws do not put themselves into effect, end quote. Now, with all fairness, Aristotle also requires the phronimos as a model, as for habituation. As he puts it, virtue is a state that decides, consisting in a mean, the mean that is relative to us, which is defined by reference to reason, to the reason by reference to which the prudent person would define it. And again, to grasp what prudence is, first, study the sort of people we call prudent. So it seems proper to a prudent person to be able to deliberate finally about things that are good and beneficial for himself, not about some restricted area, about things that promote health or strength, but about what sorts of things promote living well in general. And again, he maintains that the prudent person or the practically wise person is the one who is able to grasp the truth that involves reason and is concerned with actions about things that are good or bad for a human being. So what the phronimos or the practically wise person has is the knowledge and the ability to carry out the actions that are not just good for himself, but what is good for all human beings. Now, in order to access phronimoi as models, Aristotle maintains that we need certain external goods, and these are divided into two types. First, the goods that contribute to one's blessedness, and these include being well born, having a good family, and not looking utterly repulsive. And it's this sorts of goods of fortune that enables one to be born into a family in which he'll be able to receive the habituation of the virtues. And the second type of external goods are the instrumental goods, including friends, wealth, and political power. As he puts it, we cannot or cannot easily do fine actions if we lack the resources. In many actions, we use friends, wealth, and political power, just as we use instruments. Unfortunately, Aristotle's polis or city-state is no guarantee that one isn't born as a slave or into the laboring class, which births would prohibit a virtuous life because these people would, from the get-go, be prevented from acting courageously, generously, or justly because they won't be able to act with their own reasoning. Now, Mencius, on the other hand, offers us a benevolent government that provides the conditions for the cultivation of the virtues, or what he calls a constant heart. As he puts it, quote, "Only a noble is capable of having a constant heart while lacking a constant livelihood. As for the people, if they lack a constant livelihood, it follows that they will lack a constant heart." Continuing, he states, quote, "An enlightened ruler must regulate the people's livelihood to ensure that it is sufficient to serve their fathers and mothers, to nurture their wives and children. In good years, they're always full. In years of famine, they escape death. Only then do they rush toward the good and follow the ruler easily." In addition, Mencius also thinks that a benevolent government will provide their people with enough leisure so that they can cultivate the rituals and righteousness. So comparing the two, Mencius and Aristotle would agree about the necessity of certain external or economic goods for the cultivation of virtues. However, they'll disagree about the role of the government in providing such goods to everyone. And this is because Aristotle separates sharply the family, which belonged to the private realm, from the polis, which is the public realm. And to be a citizen in the polis actually presupposes the satisfaction of the economic necessities which lie in the private realm. Now, Mencius, in contrast, unites the family and the state so that the state is responsible for providing the economic goods for the cultivation of the virtues. As he puts it, if everyone would treat their parents as parents and their elders as elders, the world would be at peace, end quote. Again, serving one's parents is the root of all service. And so virtues for Mencius consist in extending these familial feelings that we have to the larger community and ultimately to the world. He states, quote, "Among babes in arms, there are none that do not know to love their parents. When they grow older, there are none that do not know to revere their elder brothers. treating one's parents as parents is benevolence. Revering one's elders is righteousness. There is nothing else to do but extend these to the world. Again, he says, treat your elders as elders and extend it to the elders of others. Treat your young ones as young ones and extend it to the young ones of others. And you can turn the world in the palm of your hand. It's as simple as that. So he says, people have a common saying, the world, the state, the family. The root of the world lies in the state. The root of the state lies in the family. The root of the family lies in oneself. So the cultivation of the individual is essential for the virtues. Now, granted that Aristotle also acknowledges the family and the requirement of the family for habituating the virtues. Nevertheless, his account of the polis doesn't rectify the bad luck of not being born into a functional and good family for cultivating virtues. Now, Mencius holds that the family is the root of the state, and the state in turn also ensures a functioning family, hence enabling the cultivation of the virtues, which in turn then are extended to the state and beyond. Now, both of them rely on their respective accounts of human nature that is perfected in the virtues. And that perfection requires cultivation that in turn presupposes certain social and economic conditions. And these are common requirements for all human beings. Now, apart from those resources, what I want to do now is to move to talk about justice. And Aristotle offers us two senses of justice, a general and a special or particular sense, where general justice for him refers to the complete virtue with respect to another, so that one always acts well toward others. And to do that, to have general justice, one must possess the complete set of all virtues, so that one must have courage, honor, temperance, etc., in order that one could benefit others. So in short, general justice for Aristotle is the whole of virtue. Now, in contrast, special justice is only a part of virtue for him, in that one is only just or unjust in a certain way. So being unjust in a certain way refers to how one would overreach to profit himself in matters such as honors, wealth, or safety that can be distributed among members of a community. And then fairness in the distribution of goods is also an example of special justice, in that one doesn't accord more to oneself, but the same amount as everyone else. And he calls this numerical justice. But in contrast to numerical justice, there are times when one isn't dealing with equals, so that what is called a geometric or proportional justice is relevant. So when dealing with folks who are superior to us in rank or virtue, they then are to be awarded more honors than inferiors. Now, what I want to say is that Aristotle's division of general justice and particular justice are also applicable to the Mencius. So corresponding to general justice in the Mencius is benevolence or humaneness, in that this is the love that is applicable to everyone. And special justice, in turn, in Aristotle, would correspond to righteousness in the sense that in Mencius, because this is the sort of justice that would vary with different relationships. And ultimately, it is the Phronimos and the sage, respectively, for these thinkers who possess all of the moral virtues and who are capable of general justice or benevolence. And they would know the common good for all human beings and know that certain economic and social goods are required for the cultivation of the virtues. These phronimoi and sages then would also be the ones to act virtuously and provide the conditions for the virtue of future generations. So they then would be able to offer solutions to the problems that Andina and Tung face, in that it's the knowledge of the common good for all human beings based on their views of human nature that will enable them to know the requirements for perfecting human nature, that certain social, environmental, and economic conditions are to be provided to such future generations, and that virtuous behavior in general by these practically wise persons would end up providing the wisdom and the conditions for perfecting the virtues. So what Aristotle and Mencius would offer is not an indiscriminate support for the existence of all beings or for the generation of all beings. Rather, what they offer is a practical wisdom to deal with what is right for all circumstances. And this would end up resolving Andina's issue of the lack of awareness about what we owe and why we would owe future generations certain duties. And most importantly, the motivation from Aristotle and Mencius wouldn't be for the same self-serving reasons that Andina mentions. What I want to do now is to compare Aristotle and Mencius and show that Mencius of the two would end up offering more resources than Aristotle. And surprise, surprise, we return to Aristotle's soul division, where he emphasizes the speculative over the deliberative part of the rational soul and over the non-rational part, so that it is ultimately the intellectual virtue of Sophia or contemplative wisdom that is most prioritized to human flourishing for Aristotle. And so Aristotle prioritizes theory over practice, speculative over practical wisdom, whereas for Mencius, there's no separation between the theoretical and the practical. Wisdom for Mencius isn't merely theoretical, nor is it higher than benevolence, which is practical. So human nature for Mencius consists in all these feelings, the feelings of compassion, shame or disdain, reverence, approval, and disapproval, all coming together at the same time. One is not prioritized over the other, so that ultimately, when it comes to human perfection, what is required is the cultivation of those sprouts of virtue into the complete virtues of benevolence, righteousness, ritual propriety, and wisdom. Once again, all four are required and none has priority over another. Now, ultimately, I want to say that the differences in views of human nature for Aristotle and Mencius are traceable to their first principles, God for Aristotle and Tien or heaven for Mencius. And for Aristotle, God is an unmoved mover who is separate from this world, whereas for Mencius, Tien or heaven is what creates and endows everything with a norm and nourishes its creations. So whereas Aristotle prioritized contemplative wisdom that is unworldly to match the separated God that is separated from this world, what Mencius offers us is a kind of existence whereby heaven's works can be assisted by human actions. So here are Mencius's resources that a benevolent government doesn't leave the people's livelihoods and education to fortune, and humaneness or benevolence for him is extended to the whole world. And as he puts it, the 10,000 things are all brought to completion by us. So for that reason, I think that Mencius offers us just that much more for resolving transgenerational justice issues. And that's it, the end. And you're actually still there. Thanks so much.
Very nice. Thank you very much. Yes, we will open it up to questions at this point. And you can either put a question in the chat if you need to, or let me make this so I can see everyone. There we go. Or you can raise your hand or speak up. Andreas, please. You're muted, Andreas. There you go.
Thank you. It was illuminating and interesting. Well, there are a couple of things you say that, I mean, I'm not sure whether general justice, as you put it, or as Aristotle puts it, that is the whole virtue, as you rightly put it, equals to benevolence. I mean, I don't know anything about Mencius, so I was learning, but it seems to me that it's not, well, there cannot be equality in a sense, because, well, fully virtuous man who, or woman, well, man for Aristotle is, well, is courageous, is just, but I mean, yes, well predisposed to others and so on and so forth, but I mean, but benevolence is something rather different than that. So I mean, but this is a kind of minor point. But I mean, the bigger point is, well, I was just reacting. I mean, to your. I agree with you that and Dina's. I mean, I don't know that in her work conception of transgenerational justice and I mean, in terms of rights language sounds, I mean, when she says, as you quoted, future has a right to exist, I mean, it sounds almost ridiculous. Yeah. It's almost as to say that moon has a right to exist, right? I mean, yeah, so I mean, so this this rights language, especially to the future generations, is so, I mean, at least from my point of view, so unconvincing. But more importantly, I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on this transgenerational justice from Aristotelian point of view, because I mean, you moved it rather quickly, and maybe, I mean, you can say more because, well, I mean, we cannot certainly put on the same level, that is to say, justice to future generations from the point of view of this Aristotelian common good notion. So we owe to others certain things because they are there, and we have a common good with them. but what kind of common good? I mean, I'm all for justice for future generations, but I think that the argument needs to be made in a sense stronger, right? So that so how do we owe? What do we owe? And yeah, so maybe you can elaborate. Thanks.
All right, good. Thanks so much for your questions and for your skepticism regarding my claim that when it comes to general justice in Aristotle, it is, Mencius's benevolence is the functional equivalence of general justice for Aristotle. And, there is not a one-to-one direct correspondence, I mean, when it comes to these concepts, but what I'm looking for is the functional equivalence. So whatever is the concept that does the job that is most like general justice in Aristotle. And I'm leaning on his account of how one must have all of the moral virtues in order to be able to act with general justice. And the correspondence or functional equivalent of that to the Mencius is that of, benevolence is really not the best translation of Dren or humaneness, which is a term I prefer, but essentially that term of humaneness or benevolence is for the Confucians, the highest Confucian virtue, which grows out of one's love for one's parents, especially in the home, right? So that passage about how all babies know to love their parents and how you grow that and you eventually extend that feeling of love to others in the world. And granted, that sounds a little, mushy perhaps for Aristotle, in that it seems to rely quite a bit on the feelings. But you notice that for the Mencius, it's not just a matter of the feelings, but reflection is involved. You got to ask about, okay, what is the nature of these human beings and what is it that they need to flourish? So I think that's right, a good pairing of general justice. But that in turn leads me to your second question about, okay, what's the common good then, say, for the future generations? And you notice that I'm leaning on both Aristotle's and Mencius's views of human nature. And so if you no longer, and I'm hoping that, gosh, I'm talking to a bunch of Aristotelians for the most part, and you may or may not, and perhaps are more likely to buy into the essential nature of things, that there is an essential nature to human beings in that we have these potencies that are meant to be realized in certain ways. And so by looking
thank
at
you, both of you. If no one else had anything, actually, I don't think we have enough time. So I'm just going to pop off. Josh is going to take over. Justin, I have a question for you.
I don't know who that was. Sorry.
All right. Yes, that was weird. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm going to answer your question by saying that I'm relying on human nature to tell us what the common good is, and the fact that we do need certain social, political, environmental goods for any kind of development in order to flourish in any way. Minimally, I think that right, both Aristotle and Confucius can offer us those resources to, right, focus our attention on those issues that I think then are unconditionally required for the future generations.
Thomas, please. You're muted. There you go.
Thank you, May, very much. It was very informative. I've learned a lot. I think the way you compared Aristotle and Mencius was so clarifying and helpful. I just wanted, so the problem, I just wanted to touch on the main issue that you address, I think, which is how to ground transgenerational justice. You know, we face this problem, especially nowadays, don't we? So we face this problem of grounding transgenerational justice. Now, as I understood it, I haven't read Andina, but as I understood it, she was trying to somehow ground transgenerational justice on the idea of duties and rights.
Yes.
Whereas you think that with some resources, some Aristotelian resources, and particularly some resource from Mencius, we can ground transgenerational justice on virtue and feelings, perhaps, with Mencius. Okay. Now, I don't know whether you know, I haven't read Antina, so I don't know her argument, but I guess the idea of duties and rights, the idea, in other words, of obligation, okay, that in other words, in order to ground transgenerational justice, you have to involve some kind of obligation. We need people feeling obligated, okay. I think what the claim that such an approach makes is this, that we have a problem, and the problem is that the action of one, either one individual or one community or a wider community, when united with the freedom of the other, again, individual community, then we have a problem. We have some conflict there. So the attempt to ground some kind of obligation according to the universal freedom of action for all, because that's where the idea of duties and rights is based, that the action of one can be united with the freedom of the action of the other according to the idea of universal freedom for all. Unless we ground it in such a way, the claim is from people that take this approach that you have a problem. The actions and the freedom of actions of one conflict with the freedom and actions of the other, whether we're talking about individuals, communities, wider communities, small communities, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask you this kind of problem, which seems to me very, you know, a very real problem.
Yeah.
How would it be approached or addressed even more by, you know, the Mencius approach or the Aristotelian approach?
Right. And yeah, thanks so much for that, you know, excellent question. And I think that it's intimately bound up with both of Aristotle's and Mencius's approaches that you need good politics in order to enable people to make the right choices, right? So if they're going to have the freedom to choose, they better be informed about what's good to choose. And so it's, for Aristotle, the laws, the legislators would legislate certain laws of what the people need to know to enable them to figure out what's right and what is wrong. And for Mencius, it is, right, the significance of educating the people into the right rituals and understanding. So for Mencius, by golly, if you are not going to educate the people correctly, you are not going to end up preventing, say, elderly people from being abused. So Mencius's ideal is that you're not going to have gray-haired people carrying loads of wood and walking along the road. That's not right for him. And how do you arrive at the judgment that that is not right? And how can everyone choose that, yes, no gray-haired people are going to do that kind of labor? It's by educating them. So both of these authors are going to presuppose a certain political and social and cultural institution in the state to enable people to learn how to make the right choices. And what I'm doing with both of these authors by putting the spin of human rights on their views, which given, I think we're all agreed that they did not have any views of human rights at all. So what I'm doing is that I'm saying that, okay, you take all of these prerequisites that are acknowledged by Aristotle and Mencius, and you make them into rights or entitlements to anyone in such a way that they then have the opportunity to cultivate the virtues. But that is not a guarantee that everyone will in turn become virtuous. And Aristotle is more correct about, and he acknowledges that more because he realizes that, when it comes to the majority, they are not interested in becoming virtuous. And in that case, then what we need are the laws. Then at least they will be held back from doing bad things by the laws and punishments. But with the Confucians, I think that they're going to be a little more idealistic in proposing that, all right, if you would only get the right ruler, if you would only get a benevolent ruler who knows what to do for the people, to bring them up in the right conditions so that they'll have the right understanding. So for Mencius, we and the sage are exactly alike. There's no difference. So everyone can become a sage. And Aristotle is not going to be as sanguine about that view, the perfection of all human beings. Have I answered your question, Carlos?
Yes, partly you addressed it. And I also gathered from your answer, May, that you want to use virtues to somehow ground human rights. That's your wider project. And I'm very sympathetic to that. If I may press you a bit more on the initial question. So the problem, of course, one problem arises, of course, when you have bad rulers. Because, to presuppose that, we will get a good ruler, or to sort of wish that we should get a sage as a ruler, or that we will have a philosopher king as a ruler, is a big presupposition to make. So the problem is that we get bad rulers, and not only bad rulers in politics, we get bad educators, we get bad administrators, and of course the presupposition that the Mencius presupposition about feelings, that we have those good feelings. I would grant you that, but of course we have bad feelings as well, and the problem with feelings is this, which I think is somehow important, that if we educate a young person, a young girl, a young boy, according to the idea that you have some good feelings in you, and try to develop your good feelings, and if you develop your good feelings, you will eventually become virtuous. The problem that arises there is that the more a young person emulates the Phronimos or the sage, and tries to develop these feelings, the more he or she might think that he merits or she merits her or his good fortune. So this process has the unintended consequences of making the individual believing that he or she merits any good fortune, and that therefore she becomes better and better.
Yeah.
And she cannot, or he cannot realize, that we are far from good, that we are still very much self-centered, operating according to self-love. And it seems to me that at some point you have to draw a line in educating young people between self-love, promoting self-good, self-flourishing, and so on and so forth, and promoting the good of others. Because I think there is a conflict there, and it's a genuine conflict, which, to my view, the Aristotelian paradigm and the Mencius paradigm do not so much address. Okay, let me stop here. Sorry. Thank you so much, May.
Right. I think that the presupposition that there's a tension for the community is not one that is shared by the classical thinkers in the Asians or the Greeks. For them, it's one and the same. You are right. For Aristotle, the polis is prior to the individual. And ultimately, what is good for you is what is good for the community as a whole. And we have come very far from that today. And perhaps, yes, it is the fact that we have departed from, any semblance of a community that agrees about a common good, so that, that could be the common pursuit. And I'm thinking about, where we are in the States today with the divisiveness politically, and the havoc it has wreaked as a result. And Mencius is not all that idealistic, because here he offers us a view about how, the sprouts, that are our feelings, they need to be cultivated in order to grow. And if you don't cultivate them in the right way, say if you try to rush their growth by pulling on it, then so that's the farmer from Song who went out and pulled on his sprouts and they died overnight. So that's not how we can cultivate our virtues. And also Mencius talks about the assault, the environmental assault on human development of these virtues. He talks about Ox Mountain. You look at it and you see that it's totally barren, but you didn't see it when it was totally luscious and green prior to the deforestation, prior to its being grazed upon by the cattle day in and day out. So there is realism there, that there's a fragility to the human goodness, so that, if the environmental forces are too great, then we could lose that nature entirely. The sprouts can be killed. And I think that, Aristotle could agree with that too. Anyway, I hope that I've started to answer your question there.
Karen, did you have a question?
Well, just to,
Sorry, Andres, I asked Karen if she had a question.
All right, okay.
You're muted.
You're muted, Karen.
Unmute my audio.
There
Okay,
you
you
go.
hear me now? Thank you. So I'm a historian here, and you'll see that I'm very practical. And I have some questions. I want to make a couple of comments. There's a lot of work being done now on Mencius and the environment, and his awareness of the fragility of the human condition in relation to the environment. So that's something that is really important, I think, and for historians to look at. and I know you get this question a lot, May, but I have to bring up the question of, first of all, gender, and the other question of Mencius separating out those who work with their hands, their brawn, and those who work with their minds. And I also just want to say a few things about that, how that plays out in history. I do early empires, and it always pains me to see the hopes of these philosophers and then what actually happens, because we know now that the laws are very draconian. They do not encourage humaneness or benevolence in any way. And so my question here is sometimes, what do we get? What do these philosophers really contribute to later generations? One is, I think, unlike Aristotle, there is no justification for slavery in any of the early Confucians. That's, I think, really important. And the other thing is, there is throughout Chinese history this attention to feeding the people. That is something that emperors, no matter how awful they are, know they have to do to keep their legitimacy. So some of these virtues and some of these ideals actually do play out. Many of them don't. But I'm doing a panel, or commenting on a panel of young scholars. It's called Intergenerational Relations, and how this idea of the future being the responsibility of young people often oppresses women and puts them in a position of being reproducers and so on. And I could go on, and I'm sure you've had this question, but I would just like to hear what you have to say about that.
Thanks so much, Karen. And yeah, from time to time, I get the gender question. And in fact, but not asked in the serious and polite way that you're asking. In fact, I'll get the question in the form of, how can you be defending, right, any of these thinkers, being a woman and so forth. And, I am going to go back to their accounts of human nature to defend gender. Neither of them is offering a view of human nature that is unique to genders, right? It's not just for men that you're able to do this, just for women that you can't do that. So I think that even though culturally they might have succumbed to the pressures of their generations, nevertheless, their metaphysics, I think, would rescue them from any gender disparity claims or conclusions, if you will. But as for your concern about what have these thinkers contributed, well, I think that it is entirely up to us to continue, right, taking what is relevant and what is helpful from them and assimilating, right, their views to our reasonings and thoughts and feelings, so that we could benefit from what they have to offer, instead of just throwing the baby out, right, with the bathwater, because there are definitely certain things that aren't salvageable from them, but I think that ultimately, essentially, when it comes to their metaphysics and what their metaphysics have to offer, that's something we could benefit from continuing. But thanks so much for asking that question.
Andrews?
Yes, I mean, yeah, I still want to kind of understand fully what can Aristotle say, or Mencius, what can they say as to what we owe to the future generations. And I mean, in a sense, I mean, this is a very, very important question, right? And this question, ethical question, will be raised more and more in the future. So it is essential for us, you know, as a community of academics or thinkers or whatever, to get it right. And one way to, I mean, one way to go about it would be say, well, I mean, we messed it up. I mean, but once again, what is implied in this "we messed it up"? I mean, have I messed it up? Have you? I mean, right? I mean, but in a sense, well, and that's what Karen and you know, was saying. This historical aspect is very important because, well, not by we mean sort of industrial capitalist modernity based on fossil fuel.
Yeah.
And right, so we messed it up, and therefore it is right for us to sort this out.
Yeah.
And rather than leave and pass this mess on the future generations. Right. So, but I'm not sure. I mean, and of course you can find Aristotelian resources in his conception of justice to do that. Well, I mean, well, in a sense you can argue, well, there is a pleonexy involved. Yeah, we demanded too much for ourselves without. But once again, I mean, but it's tricky, isn't it? Because it's not the same. I mean, you see the kind of a guy stealing, or a fat capitalist stealing from workers, right? And it's, you know, you clearly see pleonexia there.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the case with our generation. Yeah, stealing from the future of the future from the future generations. Thank you.
That's right. I think that you're absolutely right, that the problem with, you know, climate change and responsibility for the perpetrators of climate change, it's difficult to pinpoint individuals who are responsible. And so it's easier then for individuals to say, well, I'm not fully responsible for, right, the you know, carbon emissions. And so what can I do? And would anything that I am doing make a difference? And so that in turn could affect one's motivations to even do anything at all. But I think that, you know, this is what I'm trying to derive from Aristotle and Mencius, and maybe my solution and my proposal is naive, in that I am suggesting that, in fact, I'm saying that we go back to their virtues, unless we can inculcate in the future generations and our own generation the virtues, and this realization that it's not you against them, but rather we're all in this together, and hence we bear the same responsibility, and that responsibility extends beyond what we can see and hear and interact with. That's essential. So someone might want to accuse me of being too anthropocentric in my approach, in that I'm just focusing on human beings and what the human beings can or cannot do. But I think that that's as good a place to start as any, in that hopefully we are still open to learning and cultivation and changing ourselves, and to have enough humility to acknowledge that, by golly, the problem is immense. And where do we start? And I think that it's going to take generations, and we better work on the generations.
May, do you have enough energy to take another set of questions?
Oh yeah, sure. It's
Thank
a
you.
Saturday.
So I've got 3. I only expect you to answer one. I'm wondering about
Setting your standards low.
No, I just, the 2 of them are really more about thinking about the theoretical foundation. So the first one about Xing, I wonder if you had looked at comparing, because you've done a wonderful job of comparing the virtues and justice and that sort of stuff between Aristotle and Mencius. But it seems to me that there might be some comparisons to make between Xing and energeia as metaphysical principles, particularly as you compare this idea of the unmoved mover, which Aristotle says is energeia, right, with the concept of heaven in Mencius, right, and how that fits together. So that's more of a theoretical, metaphysical kind of thing that I'm interested in, but maybe isn't related to your talk. The second thing that I think is more related, and I think you'll probably just give me a very quick answer to this, is when you were going over Mencius's virtues, you said a couple of times that Mencius sees that righteousness, I think it was righteousness, it could be compassion, was serving one's parents. And that was repeated several times, but not the same sense of parents serving the children. So I think that relates to your talk in terms of what one of the struggles with Andina's position, which is why would future generations pay attention to what past generations have done? It seems to me that there might be a source in Mencius to kind of address that particular issue with those kinds of quotes that you had. So that, I think you'll give me a very quick answer to. And then the third is the more broader thing that I would like a little conversation on, but you can sort of, say, I don't want to talk about that right now. And that is, are we discussing the people we should be discussing? And here I'm thinking about the concept of justice and virtue in various Native American identities. So this idea of the 7th generation, right? That's already encapsulating this sense of transgenerational justice that is in Native American philosophies, a variety, I think Lakota and a few others. In this sense, you probably know McIntyre talks about the Lakota virtue of Wankanaga, right? Just generosity, which seems to me that to be maybe closer to benevolence in Mencius than Aristotle's concept of general generosity. And I'm certainly wrong about that probably, but that seems to me like maybe that's a different conception of justice that would help us think about what we owe future generations, because we have to be not just, but generous to those future generations. Sorry for all of the questions. And I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
That's great, Jeff. Yes, I won't be able to answer all of those questions, but yes, what I want to clarify the point about what we owe to our parents and what the parents owe us, and notice that benevolence is the love that one has for one's family and then extended to others. But that's also the virtue that the ruler has to manifest to his people. And when it comes to the relationship between the ruler and the people, he is like a father to his people. So what he owes to the people is the kindness, the love, and the caring that, right, he had extended to his own family, and then now to his larger family, which is the state itself. But in general, then, I mean, yeah, drun or benevolence or humaneness is mostly talked about it in terms of love. And righteousness is talked about in terms of doing the right actions. So here, the account that Mencius offers is that, look, if you wouldn't tolerate some wrongdoing to your own family members, all you need to do is to extend that same feeling of disdain, right, or shame of yourself doing something to your family members, and extend it to others, so that you're treating other people in the same way that you would treat your own family members. So if you wouldn't tolerate your sisters being paid unfairly, a lesser amount than some other male employee, then extend that feeling of indignation and disdain to other people. And then that would end up spreading the righteousness around. So yes, when it comes to these relationships, it works both ways. So it's not just love and respect, but there's also love and kindness and care. But I'll think more about the other two questions from you. But did Kelvin want to ask a question? I thought I saw his hand up.
Yeah, it occurred to me that I might. I was a little incompetent in raising my hand at appropriate time, though. Apologies. Okay, going back to your response to Andrus, which I think was going back to what you were saying initially about, well, taking a strongly historical view, let's say, and perhaps therefore an unmetaphysical view. But I didn't quite follow which was your position and which was the position that you were criticizing at the beginning, in saying that, well, taking climate change as an example, but the argument could be made much more generally about the human vocation or whatever, I suppose. But so there's a sort of historical teleology there almost, which I think is rather alien to Aristotle and perhaps also, I suspect, to Mencius, but the idea that there's a common task, a common project, and therefore I thought the position was a sort of radically unkantian one, perhaps, undeontological. Well, insofar as I may, no, apologies, I may be badly misconstruing the argument, but the argument is that because there's a common project and that one is imputing duties to future generations to continue that project, that therefore one should also impute the rights necessary to future generations such that they can acquit the duties that one's imputing to them. That therefore, I mean, this is a functional, a sort of almost a desert-based justification for duties, I take it, that they have duties, one another has duties and therefore they should have the rights attributed to them. Okay, so is that a position that's common to yourself, your own position? Right, that, okay, good. So I did understand what was going on. That's the position that you're criticizing.
That's correct.
Right.
That was
Well, okay, perhaps I could pose a very simple question after that. I mean, this strikes me as quite an attractive argument. Why are you so opposed to that argument? I mean, it's an argument based in a practical philosophy rather than a metaphysics, but that doesn't strike me as necessarily a bad thing. But yourself?
Well, according to Andina, she actually formulates it as a metaphysics of social action. So she wants to call it a metaphysics, but whatever she wants to call it is fine. And here my criticism was because of the presuppositions underlying such a position. Namely that you are assuming that the future will continue whatever projects you have started. And then that's one point. And my other point is that it sounds kind of self-serving that here you're only fulfilling your duties toward people in the future because you want them to be able to continue what you have started. And that just strikes me as kind of unvirtuous motivation, if you will. So it doesn't strike me as a right motive. But ultimately, I think that the defense of what we owe to the future is because they, like us as human beings, have the same needs and common goods as we do, and hence they have the right to the conditions for the development of those goods and virtues. That's why we are responsible for fulfilling our duties to them. So yes, I'm defending their rights on the basis of the duties that they would be able to develop. I'm offering them the conditions for the development of the duties, regardless of whether they will go on to pursue those development of virtues or not.
Right. Well, if I could, okay. So yeah. So your argument, in a sense, is also well, almost a desert type argument, or a functional argument, as I prefer. And rights are, one's assuming a certain conditionality of rights. Then.
Yeah.
Okay. And all right. So yeah, your argument is not at all sort of historically teleological. Then we're not assuming we're not you'd be opposed to the historical, modern historical sort of argument that we might suppose the progress of reason such that it wouldn't be a problem if the reasoning of future generations is more progressive and superior to ours. Right, okay. Again, strongly sort of anti-Kantian or maybe anti-Hegelian there. But look, okay, you said about the state, though, state legislation being educative in the virtues, insofar as there's a worry that the reasoning of future generations might differ from our own. Couldn't we maybe this is too historical, but getting away from human nature to human culture, perhaps, couldn't we say, well, if we want future generations to reason in the way we do, irrespective of whether we might wish to do so because of this idea that I do find quite attractive of being engaged in a common project that we want them to continue. But nonetheless, if we are concerned that future generations would reason in the same way as us, doesn't that give us a very strong reason to, well, to act virtuously towards them, to practice right, okay.
Yes,
So
I think that you are absolutely right. And in that regard, I am very much attracted to the promotion of certain institutional, resources in order to inculcate the virtues in the future. So the continuance of those traditions and institutions and whatever structures would support the continuance of certain educational resources and reasoning, the promotion of certain reasonings. Yes, I think that that's what we do in continuing and promoting certain traditions and institutions. And that, sure, if you want to say that that's kind of self-serving because it is important to us, and then we want that to, for the future, go right ahead. But I think that for Aristotle and Mencius, it stops at a certain level because they would want to say that they hang, those values actually hang on our human natures. It's the type of beings we are, the fact that we could go either way, the fragility of our goodness is such that, yes, if unpromoted, our sprouts would die and we would never be perfected.
Right, thank you.
Thomas?
I'm sorry, I know perhaps it's late. Just to make a point, addressing, I think, both May's position and Kelvin's position. If I understand Kelvin correctly, we're involved in a common project without any metaphysical assumptions, which perhaps somebody else might make, perhaps not May. But I think that both positions presuppose an idea, and this is the idea of humanity. Okay, for example, May, I think you're saying that everybody should be able to develop their virtues.
Yeah.
I think that's a presupposition of your position. So if that's the case, then you presuppose the idea of humanity. And Kelvin as well, when he says that we are all involved in a common project, these generations, future generations, etc. Obviously, he's not talking about the future generation of our own community. We are talking here about the future generations of humans. When we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about the future generation of our own community. So the common project is a project of humanity. So we have to presuppose, some notion of humanity. Otherwise, you cannot do it. That's my point anyway. So it's Kantian, Kelvin, in the end. It's not un-Kantian.
Okay, did you want to respond to that, May?
No, I think that, yes, I agree with Tollas's observation, and I'm fine having Kant have the last word here.
Okay. Let's thank May for such a wonderful presentation and the conversation and staying with us to answer all these questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the stimulating questions and for staying for such a long presentation. But it was fun for me.
Excellent, I'm glad so. If you're interested in CASEP events, please send me an email to stay informed, and I will let you know of our future events. And have a wonderful weekend. For those of you who are grading, have fun grading. And those of you celebrating Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah and Merry holidays to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for organizing this, Jeff. And thanks
you're
so
welcome.
much to
Thank you.
everyone. Take care.
Thank you, May.
All right.